What we're about to unpack is a truly painful story that unfolded in Indore back in October 2025. It's about a desperate act that became a massive national wake-up call. We're going to dig into a crisis that brought an entire community to its knees, but then, incredibly, helped it get back on its feet. This whole complicated story, it really just boils down to one single shocking number: 24. And we're not talking about a statistic here. We're talking about 24 human beings, 24 lives pushed right to the absolute brink. So, what happened? Well, on October 15th, 2025, those 24 people, they all took poison at the same time. This was a coordinated, desperate act by members of Indore's transgender community, also known as the Kinnar community. I mean, just imagine. They truly felt like they had no other way out. It's just almost unimaginable, right? I mean, why? Why would 24 people feel so completely trapped, so utterly hopeless, that this seemed like their only option? To get to the bottom of that, we've got to unravel a really tangled story of power, crime, and just deep betrayal. Okay, so this whole thing didn't just happen out of the blue, not at all. Think of it like a volcano. The events of that October day, that was the violent eruption. But the pressure had been building, simmering for years. This was a really deep wound, right inside the community itself. So what was at the heart of all this tension? It all comes down to something called the Gadi. Now, this isn't just some fancy leadership title. The Gadi is the traditional seat of power. It's a huge deal. It controls territory, money, property, basically the whole social structure. And for decades, there had been this power struggle brewing over who gets to sit on that throne, so to speak. And things got way, way more intense after the previous leader died. So this fight basically split the community right down the middle. You had two sides. On one side, you've got the established group, the ones in power, led by Payal Guru. And on the other, you've got the challengers, led by Sapna Haji, who were dead set on taking control. This was the massive fault line running through everything. But hang on a second. A power struggle, even a really bitter one over money and territory, that's one thing. That alone doesn't usually lead to a mass suicide attempt. It just doesn't explain the poison. So something else must have happened, right? There had to be a breaking point, a trigger, that turned this internal fight into an absolute criminal nightmare. So, what was it? And this is where the story takes a really dark, sinister turn. Two guys, Akshay Kumaro and Pankaj Jain, show up pretending to be journalists. And their arrival kicks off this just systematic campaign of terror. We're talking blackmail, nonstop threats, and even horrific allegations of sexual assault. And it was all designed to do one thing: extort money. Just listen to this. It really sums up the terror they were feeling. Imagine being squeezed from two sides. On the inside, you've got this bitter community dispute, and from the outside, you've got these criminals preying on you. With their reputations, their safety, everything on the line, they felt completely and utterly trapped. Incredibly, miraculously, every single one of them survived. They were all hospitalized, but they pulled through. So while the attempt itself failed, their message was heard loud and clear. That desperate act was like a scream for help so loud that the entire country had no choice but to listen. And the reaction was immediate. The wider transgender community just wasn't having it. They rallied together, staging huge public protests right there in Indore. They were demanding justice, demanding protection, basically demanding that someone be held accountable. It got so serious that the prominent leader Laxmanara and Chupaki publicly pleaded for police security. That's how real the danger felt. Well, with all that public pressure, the authorities had to act. And they did. Cases were filed against some of the key players, including Sapna Haji, the leader of the rival faction. And those two guys posing as journalists, Akshay Kumar and Pankaj Jain, they were arrested, along with a few others who were allegedly part of this whole harassment scheme. Look, the police quickly realized this wasn't a simple case. You had the internal community feud, you had organized crime, you had property disputes. It was a complete mess. So to really get to the bottom of it, they took a pretty big step. They formed a special investigation team, an SIT, basically a dedicated group of experts whose whole job was to untangle this complicated web and figure out what really happened. So you might be thinking, okay, this is a horrible, tragic crime story from one city. But was it just a local issue? Absolutely not. The events in Indore, they were really a symptom of much, much bigger problems happening all over the country. And here's why. The whole crisis in Indore basically held up a mirror to the rest of the country, and what it reflected were these really deep systemic failures. It showed in the most brutal way how internal community fights can be hijacked and weaponized by criminals from the outside. And it put a huge spotlight on the fact that there's often a massive lack of legal protection for vulnerable communities, a kind of administrative negligence where authorities just ignore these internal problems until something absolutely tragic happens. Yeah, because of everything it dragged out into the open, this whole incident is now seen as a real watershed moment. It forced a national conversation that was long overdue. A conversation about leadership struggles within marginalized groups, about the failures of our justice system, and about the most fundamental thing of all, the right for minority communities in India to feel safe. And that's really where this leaves us, right? With huge critical question. After bringing an entire community to the very edge, will this crisis actually lead to real, meaningful change? Does it point towards a future with better protection, with serious internal reforms, with actual justice? Or does it just highlight a deep vulnerability that's going to keep being exploited? And that, right there, is the challenge that lies ahead.